Good evening. That was Dennis Healy. We'll be speaking to him very shortly. The prospect of conflict with Argentina has not, so far, been averted by the talks Mr. Francis Pym has been having with Mr. Hague in Washington. Mr. Pym reports serious difficulties, but he still refers to there being life in Mr. Hague's mission and he wants it to continue. And off to Washington tomorrow, Mr. Costa Mendes, the Argentine foreign minister. In his first British interview since the dispute began, he tells Newsnight that he believes there's an even chance of war.
If I were to be very objective, I would say half and half.
Another visitor to America tonight, Mr. Dennis Healy, Britain's Shadow Defence Foreign Secretary, will be telling us how his ideas on UN involvement were received when he met the UN General Secretary. And today's other major news comes from the Middle East. Just 2 days before the Israelis withdraw from Sinai, we've a special report from David Sells in Jerusalem.
And I'll be reporting on the record damages awarded to a black couple said to have been beaten up by the police, and at the decision of Provisional Sinn Féin to fight the elections for a Northern Ireland Assembly.
Right now, it's dusk in the South Atlantic. Britain's task force, Mrs. Thatcher's earnest of intent, is now well within hours of a possible war. If she chooses to use them, from now on, the ships are there. Up to 10,000 British servicemen in 20 warships, backed up by a fleet of 35 more support ships. The seas, one report tonight suggests, are as high as 40 feet, and the wind as fast as 70 miles an hour. The main task force is almost certainly on a course that will keep it well out of the range of Argentine shore-based aircraft, except, of course, the big long-range 707 plane that's been trying to keep an eye on them. A detachment of the fleet, how big we don't know, is also, almost certainly, within immediate striking distance of South Georgia, 800 miles to the east. All ships have now, for some hours, been at what are called defence stations, the second highest state of readiness. That's half the crew on watch, the other half fully dressed and ready for action at a few moments' notice. And tonight, the BBC World Service is sending this message at frequent intervals on its South American wavelengths.
Now that the British task force is approaching the area of the Falkland Islands, a period of increasing tension and risk could lie ahead, which should be taken into account by all British citizens remaining in Argentina. Those who have not so far acted upon earlier warnings are asked to consider again whether they should take an early opportunity of leaving the country by normal commercial means.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the talks go on to try to avoid a conflict. But all the noises made by officials on both sides tonight are pessimistic. And Mr. Francis Pym himself said the gap between the two sides is still very wide indeed. He's planning to leave for home tonight in just 2 hours' time. In Washington, Charles Wheeler.
All the indications are that Mr. Pym's visit to Washington has produced nothing of substance at all. The talks aren't over yet in the sense that Mr. Pym is still here, but he gives the appearance of a foreign secretary who's preparing for departure. He's had a last lunch with Mr. Hague, he's given final interviews, and he still says that his intention is to leave tonight. In fact, some would say he looks like a man who feels he's in the wrong place and can't wait to get home where the action is. He also looks distinctly pessimistic. He denies that he shot his bolt, but the most positive thing he could find to say about the result of his mission was this: I can't report any particular progress except for a very thorough examination of the possibilities. Now, that can only mean that the very wide gap between the British position and what the Foreign Office calls those horrendous Argentine proposals is as wide as ever. And if that is the case, the American attempt to mediate may peter out, simply because there is nothing more Mr. Hague can do, except perhaps have a token meeting with the Argentine foreign minister when he arrives here in Washington this weekend. But whether it's worth going on with the peace process is an American decision, unless Britain preempts that choice by using force. Mr. Pym talked about that possibility to Keith Graves.
Because if at the end of the day we cannot conclude this by peaceful means, well then it might come to the use of force. Nobody wants that to happen. But once you allow an aggressor simply to remain and enjoy the fruits of his aggression, totally unprovoked and completely unlawful, and I may say, in contradiction and in conflict with a United Nations Security Council resolution, well then you've got anarchy in the world. We can't allow that to happen. So if they say they're going to go on staying there, well, I'm afraid something's got to be done about it.
Of your counter-proposals that you brought with you from London, do you know if they've been communicated yet to Buenos Aires?
Well, I'm not going into any details of negotiations, and I'm not sure that counter-proposals is quite the right word, but all I can tell you is that in the area which we've been discussing all along about how we could, by peaceful means, achieve the withdrawal and the subsequent arrangements, that we are discussing, and there are a variety of ways of doing it, and I'm sure it's right to explore it, because if we can achieve the result by peaceful means, everybody would be thankful.
Let me put it another way, and has Secretary Haig, who knows better than anyone the positions of both sides, has he given you any indication, having looked at your proposals, that there may be some hope?
Well, he's sharing all the views and judgments that he can bring to it, and no doubt if he does go again to Argentine, and that is not settled yet, he would convey to them the position as we see it. He's been doing that already, and he may continue with that, but that remains to be seen.
At the back of all the discussions, you keep talking about time running out, and that if necessary, we'll have to resort to use of military force. When do you think that that threat, though you might not agree with that word, but when do you think it loses its credibility?
I don't think it does lose its credibility for some time. Mr. Haig has said a number of times he thinks time is running out, and I think in a way this process ought to be brought to a conclusion at the moment when it seems that no further advance can be made. There's going to be no hope. Now that hope does still exist at the moment, and so long as it does, then I'm sure it's right to continue with it, but it's quite wrong to put any time scale on it.
Have the Americans put any pressure on you to keep the talks going?
Well, it's up to Mr. Haig to keep the talks going. We think that an arrangement through his mission and his shuttle is the best outcome that there could be. It's by no means certain that he will be successful, but it would be the best outcome if it can be achieved.
If Britain does resort to force, there is bound to be a sharp reaction from the foreign ministers of the Rio Treaty countries. They are meeting in Washington on Monday to consider an Argentine request for so far unspecified but joint action against Britain. Now, that's the meeting the Americans tried and failed to prevent and are still worried about, because a two-thirds majority vote could compel America to take diplomatic or economic action against Britain. Keith Graves put it to Mr. Pym that this American dilemma might be a compelling reason for Britain to decide against using force just now.
Now look, the Argentinians started this military activity. They invaded the Falkland Islands. They have no right to be there whatsoever, and they are a member country of the OAS states. The United Nations has called upon them to withdraw. They have failed to do that. So it's no good talking to us as though we were some guilty party if there were some military action that were to take place. I mean, I'm not saying whether there will be, whether there won't be. I'm not commenting at all on that, as you know. But you asked me directly, and the answer is they started this war. Military action has already been taken. We haven't taken any military action yet.
And you will feel free to use military action when you decide it's necessary?
Yes, indeed. But we hope that there will be a peaceful settlement.
Mr. Pym with Keith Graves. The Foreign Secretary has not met President Reagan. The British would have liked such a visit. They were too polite to ask for it, and it hasn't happened. Apparently, the President is guarding his public position of neutrality, since if he saw Mr. Pym, he'd have to see the Argentine Foreign Minister as well. As the White House sees it, while there is American neutrality, there is hope, but it's wearing very thin.
Now, Mr. Healy in New York, can I first ask you about your talks today with the United Nations Secretary General? Do you still think, as you were saying last week and the week before, that there's some way in which he can stop war?
Well, there are two sides to this. The first is that there's no question at all that the Secretary General is ready to provide an interim administration in the Falklands once the Argentines have left, providing that Mr. Haig persuades Britain and Argentina to ask him to do so. That's the first thing. And I still think, more than ever, that this could provide the answer to at least one of the problems in the negotiation, which is the nature of the arrangements on the island in the interval between the withdrawal of Argentine forces and the negotiation between Britain and the Argentine of a permanent settlement. The second thing is that if the Hague mission should peter out, then there's no question whatever, the Security Council will be called together by somebody. I hope very much it'll be called together by the British government to ask the Secretary General to take over where Mr. Haig left off, and that would free the Americans to do what I think American public opinion wants them to do, and that's to put pressure on the Argentines for a peaceful settlement. I think one of the big problems at the moment is the Americans are in danger of making exactly the same mistake as Mrs. Thatcher made. That's to say, not using pressure on the Argentines before the fighting starts, and then being in a position where they have to try to exercise pressure, much more pressure, in a situation much more difficult and dangerous, where the use of pressure costs them far more.
Mr. Healy, do you think the government is now very close to the stage at which it can begin to argue it has no alternative but to use force?
I don't think it's by any means there yet. My impression is that if Mr. Haig thinks there's life in his mission, he will go to Buenos Aires again, because I don't think that the Argentine foreign minister has the power to reach an agreement. I think the agreement will have to be reached not just with General Galtieri in Buenos Aires, but with his military junta, which includes some other very important military people. The second thing, as I say, is Britain is committed by its own draft resolution to the Security Council to seek a peaceful settlement, and if Mr. Haig's efforts fail, then we must bring in the United Nations directly.
So even if there were a quick and perhaps successful attack on South Georgia before this mission were complete, you would oppose that, would you?
Not necessarily. I think South Georgia is very different from the Falkland Islands. First of all, it's never until very, very recently been claimed by the Argentines. It's a direct dependency of Britain. It isn't part of the Falkland Islands. Secondly, the occupation of South Georgia could take place with very little, probably no loss of life at all. And thirdly, if the weather is, as you described it earlier in this programme, it will be absolutely essential to put the British troops ashore so that they can recover from the appalling conditions in which they're being held below decks on Invincible and Hermes
Mr. Healy,
before they're in a position to take any action.
Just in the last few seconds that we have in talking to you, could I just be clear, are you actually saying that you would support a quick attack on South Georgia even while negotiations continue?
It would depend on the circumstances, but I don't believe that, I wouldn't call it an attack, because so far as I know there's only a handful of Argentine troops there. I think the occupation of South Georgia would not prejudice fatally the negotiations, but I can think...
Mr. Healy, thank you very much indeed. We must leave you there. Dennis Healy, Shadow Foreign Secretary. In Argentina itself, war fever continues to mount, with the government there apparently starting an emergency arms buying campaign. They're said to be gravely short of ammunition, and they've appealed to neighbouring Brazil to supply a number of items at very short notice. They've also apparently succeeded in winning artillery ammunition from Israel, according to a Reuters report, quoting what it calls arms trade sources in Buenos Aires. Tomorrow, Argentina's Foreign Minister, Mr. Costa Mendes, goes to Washington. But there are no plans for him yet to meet President Reagan or Mr. Haig. In this exclusive interview tonight, the first he's given British television since the dispute began, Argentina's Foreign Minister spoke to Newsnight's John Stapleton.
Mr. Costa Mendes, you're about to go to Washington. What are the hopes and what are the fears that you take with you?
I would say that I have very few fears and many hopes. Hopes of receiving again a substantial solidarity from the Latin American countries, and hopes of still having the possibility of arriving to a peaceful negotiation or a peaceful settlement of the difference with Britain.
What would you identify as the main differences between the two sides at the moment?
I would say that the biggest difference is that still sovereignty. Argentina can negotiate and can discuss many ways of settling the dispute, except sovereignty.
Would I be right in thinking that the current position is that Britain is willing to turn back its fleet and then discuss the question of sovereignty, whereas Argentina says we will only withdraw our troops if you guarantee us that the Malvinas, as you call them, are ours, that sovereignty is ours?
This is not exactly, but you are not very far from the point. I would say that we are mainly interested in discussing and establishing a sort of statute for the inhabitants of the islands, recognizing them all sorts of rights, religion, language, of course property, freedom, every freedom, and the possibility for them to maintain their own ways of living, the old British ways of living. But what we are also even decided very firmly, and so we have communicated the American government, that we are ready to recognize those rights or those interests that Great Britain itself may have on the islands or concerning the islands, having a refueling station, having a scientific station, well, and other rights or interests that could come up during the discussions. Even we are ready to pay all sort of damages that we may have caused. We are ready to pay compensation to those islanders that wish to leave. We would like to offer them land in Argentina, in the southern provinces of Argentina. We would be ready to pay a ticket if they would like to go to Australia, New Zealand, Britain itself, and even gave them some other compensation if they need to buy a house or a piece of land there.
But on the question of sovereignty, your stance at the moment is that you will only withdraw your troops if sovereignty is guaranteed to Argentina.
Yes, in one way or the other.
But don't you see the British point of view that they really can't be seen to reward people who invade what they regard as their territory? They can't be seen to reward them.
This is their argument, and in any civilized discussion, each party has its own arguments. Britain has its own arguments. I have my own arguments, and the arguments of the British government are there to be discussed. My arguments or my government's arguments are very clear. This was taken from Argentina by the British by an act of force, maintained by continuous act of force, and the negative of the British to discuss the problem of sovereignty has really conducted us, plus many other things, to the present situation.
But they are willing to discuss it now, as we understand it. They are willing to say, okay, we'll pull back the fleet and discuss it. Aren't you being unreasonable in not discussing it now?
No, this is not true, but really I wouldn't like to discuss the terms of the, or I wouldn't like to discuss the present terms of the negotiation.
Could you?
The negotiation should be secret, and should be, the terms of the negotiation should be kept secret and should be kept for the parties.
What impression have you formed of Mr. Pym and Mrs. Thatcher during this conference?
Unfortunately, I haven't met Mr. Pym, neither Mr. Pym nor Mrs. Thatcher, so I haven't got any personal impression about them. Of Mrs. Thatcher, naturally, I have the impression of being first-class leader, an excellent Tory leader, but I have the feeling that concerning Argentina, especially concerning the Malvinas question, she has been either too rigid, or she hasn't paid enough attention before the 2nd of April to the question.
Would you consider accepting, in the short term anyway, a tripartite administration of these islands?
I cannot tell you that now. I can't make any comments on what could be the terms of a possible transaction.
But if only to comfort the many millions of people in both our countries, could you not identify a possible way out?
You know, if I were to identify that possible way out, I would be telling you what I have not told yet the people that are involved in the negotiation. And I think this would be really sort of breaking the fundamentals, the rules of secret diplomatic negotiation.
I don't know whether or not you're a betting man, but if you are, how would you rate the chances of our two countries going to war?
It's a very difficult question. Involves, have we got the crystal ball? Could you lend it to me?
I'm afraid I don't have one either.
You haven't.
But you know far more about it than me, sir.
Without it, if I were to be very objective, I would say half and half. But the optimistic side I have in the right part of my head would really resist to the idea of a war in the 20th century with a sort of big armada advancing in the Atlantic just to recolonize two small islands that are 12,000 miles away from Britain and 300 miles away from Argentina, that have communications with Argentina, not with Britain, that receive fuel and gas and food from Argentina, not from Britain, that in the last years have been really far closer to Argentina than to Britain. I as a human being, I'm not talking now as an Argentine, as a human being, I resist the idea of that sort of war.
Argentina's foreign minister, and that key quote again: Argentina's sovereignty must be guaranteed in one way or the other before their troops will withdraw. Now a look at some of the other developments in the Falklands crisis. Here's Linda.
The Argentine president, General Galtieri, has spent the day bolstering the morale of his forces during visits to military bases in the south of the country. And he said that he wants talks about ways of guaranteeing the lifestyle and the culture of the Falkland Islanders. Meanwhile, Argentine television has been reporting his visit to the islands at length, starting with his flight across the water. Christopher Morris reports.
From the cockpit of the Argentine Air Force jet, General Galtieri had his first sight of the British islands his troops invaded exactly 3 weeks ago. He called it an historic moment, one which generations of Argentines have dreamed of for 150 years. A hero's welcome awaited the president from the new military governor, General Menendez. But not one British resident turned out to greet the Argentine conqueror on the drive to the capital, Port Stanley, now renamed Puerto Argentino, a snub which could not have pleased him. But essentially, this was a military celebration, and under the Argentine flag he's vowed will never be hauled down, Galtieri thanked his commanders for victory. Inside the barracks, so recently occupied by the Royal Marines forced to surrender, Argentine soldiers now wait and anxiously contemplate the arrival of the British task force. There are over 10,000 troops. Galtieri says morale is high, and the troops are ready to fight till the last drop of blood, to defend the Malvinas Islands, as Argentina now calls them.
The mysterious Argentine woman calling herself Miss Liberty, who's been broadcasting to the task force to try to undermine their morale, ran into a few problems today. The Grantham businessman who's been listening in to her said she'd broken down in mid-sentence several times and finally ended up talking gibberish. This was what she'd said earlier in one of her clearer moments.
A British frigate sailing towards the Malvinas, as James is going, unsuccessfully pursued a submarine for over 20 minutes, which was apparently operating in waters surrounding Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic. After several sonar tests, the unidentified object was shown to be traveling at a speed of 15 knots, that is around 25 kilometers an hour, and it proved to be a harmless whale. A whale, my dear Dina. Yes, wasn't that funny?
Well, now the Middle East. With just 2 days to go before Israel's final withdrawal from Sinai, the way now seems clear for Egypt to take over. Israeli troops and police have now evicted the last few religious extremists from the Sinai without a shot being fired. As from this morning, the town of Yamit in occupied Sinai literally ceased to exist, pulverized into the ground by giant Israeli bulldozers. For an awkward hour or so, it looked as if the small group of militants who had been holed up in a concrete bunker for several days would manage to stay put. They believe this place belongs to Israel by biblical right, and they intended to wreck Sunday's handover to Egypt by barricading themselves in. But eventually, they were dragged out by troops. Another group of protesters had staged a sit-in on top of a war memorial. but they too were brought down without any casualties. It was a sad day for the soldiers as well as the settlers, and the army's customary efficiency was tinged with reluctance. Most Israelis believe that any warmth that Egypt has felt for Israel since the Camp David Accord will soon cool once Egypt gets this land back. In fact, such is the mutual suspicion engendered by the Sinai issue that the two sides are to hold separate ceremonies when the peninsula is finally handed over this Sunday. David Sells has been analysing the mood of the Israeli people.
Wherever they were when the siren sounded, whatever they were doing, the Jews of Israel stopped this week to pay tribute to their 6 million co-religionaries murdered in the Nazi Holocaust, a slaughter which haunts the life of modern Israel. A silent army of statues in a field in the south recalls that Israel was embattled from the start. The Holocaust barely over, its survivors in their new Middle Eastern state became the target of neighboring Arab nations. A farm settlement here held off an Egyptian army attack for a vital 5 days. The statues are Egyptians who were to fight Israelis in a further 3 major wars. The peace treaty with Egypt has put an end to war on Israel's southern border. Or has it? Many Israelis are not yet sure. They're still not convinced that sites like this have gone forever. There are those, like the fanatics of Yamit, for whom no return of occupied territory is acceptable. There are others, very many others, less vociferous, more reasonable, who favour the gamble of a peace treaty with Egypt, but remain uneasy at the handing back of the Sinai desert buffer, which for years has kept an Egyptian army at bay. A wilderness, most of it, where nomads great and small once shared the sands. A new Israeli fence marks its borders. Gone is the bulwark against Egyptian attack, gone the air bases, the early warning system, the oil wells. The last chunk of desert Sinai returns to Egyptian sovereignty on Sunday. Diplomacy has profited Egypt, where sister Arab nations still pay lip service to war. In North Sinai, the Israeli pullout has been total. Everything movable moved, the rest bulldozed and buried. 15 years of occupation wiped out. Did Israeli authorities think ahead, supplying these Sinai settlement houses as prefabs in the 70s? Or was it just chance? Anyway, into storage they go. In southeast Sinai, by contrast, Israeli buildings have been left, sold to Egypt for a song, unlike these. But up here, the thought seems to have been to discourage Egyptian resettlement near the border by leaving, as Israelis say, clean sands.
We brought here water pipes.
From the ground?
From the ground. We didn't took it out. The green houses, the garage, and everything that we could take. Everything except the roads and even the plants, the mango plants, and everything that we could take, we took.
Why?
Why? Because we didn't want to leave it. We worked a lot to achieve it.
On one small transplanted kibbutz, they've had to start again from scratch, repeating their desert labors of 7 years ago. Barely a month since they abandoned Sufa in the Sinai. They're now a stone's throw from the frontier, this time in Israel proper. Kibbutz members are young, idealistic, in the old Jewish pioneer tradition of cooperative farming. No zealots here. But even so, some memories are bitter for what they've lost.
Well, I tell you, it's heartbreaking. It's really hard to cope with it. You can't still cope with it. And it's like, what I feel, it's like taking a part of me. I know, when I remember the day I left, I cried like a baby.
The new Sufa has links with an old established settlement next door, which has 2 small factories to supplement its farming income, one making plastic bags and coverings. Sufa has almost 100 people on its books, and 10 of them work in the factories. Nobody was happy about leaving the Sinai. When you went there, it was an occupied territory. So didn't you think perhaps you were taking a gamble, a risk?
No. It was calling from the government. It was a very important thing to sit there, because everybody knows that where you build a settlement, nothing will move it.
What do you feel about the peace itself?
About the peace, I can't believe in that peace. It's not a real peace. Because if a few kilometers make so many problems, it can't be a real peace.
Sufa's mango plantation has been moved from Sinai lock, stock and barrel. 3,500 trees uprooted and shifted to the new site. The move has been government financed, and compensation to the few thousand genuine Sinai settlers has been liberal. These particular kibbutzniks spurned the cash. Their only condition was that everything they had created be moved with them, and so it was. Unlike the zealots of Yamit, they obeyed their government without question, but it wasn't easy.
I don't know if I have dreams for the future, but I believe that it will be good, because maybe I don't want to believe that after what we've done, there will be nothing and it will be like the same it was before.
As is the nation, so are the young settlers divided about the merits of the peace. They can't forget the years of making the Sinai bloom. And with your former prefab to hand, there's an additional tug to the memory.
How is this? All those walls.
How do you feel seeing it just stacked up like that?
Oh, I can't tell you my feelings. It's hard to tell it.
Is there anything in your view that would justify the move, would make it worthwhile?
Yes, if there will be peace. It was worse. We hope that there will be peace. And I just want to visit in Egypt in about 5 years or 10 years as a tourist, not as a soldier.
A decent dream. But Israelis as a whole remain sceptical and uneasy, and close to the new border, they're keeping their guard up. Without Egypt, the Arab nations cannot again make war on Israel. But, this achieved, Israelis are turning now to question the quality of the peace they've negotiated, forgetting perhaps that you tend to get out of life and peace treaties only what you put into them. Israelis, it would seem, have mixed feelings about the withdrawal from Sinai on Sunday, and indeed about the peace process as a whole. I have with me a member of the Israeli cabinet, Mr. Yitzhak Modai. Mr. Modai, your people do seem rather uneasy and skeptical about the Sinai withdrawal and the peace. What have you done to try to reassure them about the merits of the peace?
Well, I don't think anybody doubts the merits of the peace. If there is any doubt in people's minds, it's whether the peace will be implemented genuinely and will last a long time. And that is quite understandable. We cannot assure our people more than we ourselves are assured. And what we really and truly have at hand is a peace treaty properly signed and witnessed. With that, we can only hope and pray that the peace treaty that was signed will be a lasting one.
But you don't mean it's no more than a bit of paper?
Not at all. Who would give such a vast territory in exchange for just a piece of paper? But as in all peace treaties, there is hardly any guarantee that can be given which is solid enough, as solid as the land, as the territory that we have returned to the Egyptians.
Mr. Modaei, all this week on TV screens in Israel and indeed around the world, we've seen pictures of Yamit, the town in Sinai, which has returned now virtually to dust. If you really believe in this peace process with the Egyptians, why did you grind it back into the sands? Why didn't you hand it over to them?
Well, it is a very bad day for me today to discuss the Yamit issue, particularly with a question that in a way rubs it in too hard. Now, nothing that we've done to implement the peace treaty is outside the scope of the agreement and the understanding. So if at one point we have offered the Egyptians to sell them Yamit and they have rejected it, at another point we took it up with them that if Yamit is returned the way it stood with us, would they feel easy with it? Because it may be misused by some elements, this side of the border or the other side of the border. And what we've done with so much pain to Yamit, which was really put down to ashes, as you say, was with the full consent of the Egyptians. Under the circumstances, there was hardly anything else we could do to ensure that people will not try and get back into it.
But was this a last-minute decision? I know of nobody in Israel who knew about it last week, for example.
Well, you don't talk to the right people. There was still an open chance, but as much as there was an open chance, there won't be a withdrawal on time. So these things are normally settled at the last minute.
Could I ask you about something else which has been a feature of this week, which was the Israeli air raid on PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, targets in Lebanon, a rather blunt instrument, I think. If this had taken place next week, when the Egyptians had already had back their occupied land, or something similar like this were to happen again, how do you think this would affect your relations with Egypt when their hands are no longer tied diplomatically?
May I please rephrase the question? The issue has not started with the bombardment of PLO targets. The issue has started with murdering, mining, throwing bombs and grenades on some of Israeli quiet citizens around the country, and unfortunately even diplomatic representatives, as you very well recall. Now, one thing I would tell you, notwithstanding the effect it might have had or may have had on the peace treaty with Egypt, Israel will not, has not, and will not in the future let things like this happen without retaliation, or at least warning that they should not have repeated it. Now, frankly, I don't see the difference between doing it this week, when we still control part of the Sinai, or next week, after we return that part of the Sinai. On the contrary, I would say that if we would have such considerations, maybe we should have waited with the warning. The fact is that we don't think the two have anything to do with one another. I mean, the Egyptians and us carry on our lives according to a peace treaty on which both parties have agreed, and we have to react to PLO murderous deeds in the way we feel would quieten them down and stop them from doing it.
To Cabinet Minister Yitzhak Modaei in Israel tonight. In a moment, we examine a great British motor racing fiddle. First, though, Linda has more news.
A middle-aged black couple who were brutally beaten up by police officers 6 years ago have been awarded over £51,000 damages. The couple, Mr. David White and his wife Lucille, were, in the words of the judge, subjected to a catalogue of violence and inhuman treatment by young officers. Both had suffered multiple injuries when 17 officers raided their home in London during the night in September 1976. The judge, Mr. Justice Mars Jones, said the police had jumped the gun when they invaded the house, knowing that a search warrant for stolen goods had been issued and was on its way. In the event, he said, the warrant was never produced. The officers' entry was illegal, and the couple had every right to resist them. The judge described the way the police behaved as monstrous, wicked, and shameful conduct in the name of justice. The effect of their behaviour, he added, could do immense damage to race relations. The couple were acquitted after a Crown Court trial. Scotland Yard said tonight that they would now study the papers and decide next week whether to discipline any of the officers concerned. The Provisional Sinn Féin, that's the political wing of the Provisional IRA, is to fight the autumn elections for a Northern Ireland Assembly. Rory O'Brady, Sinn Féin's president, said they were doing so to give the nationalist people a Republican vote. It's thought that any Sinn Féin candidate elected would follow an abstentionist policy and not sit in the Assembly. Peter.
A much depleted field will contest this weekend's San Marino Grand Prix after the latest row to split this troubled sport. Most of the British teams have pulled out after the decision to disqualify the Brabham and Williams teams from the recent Brazilian Grand Prix, in which they finished first and second. The International Motorsport Federation said the cars were below the minimum weight limit during the race, and as a result, their World Championship points were withdrawn. So on Sunday, only about a dozen cars will start the San Marino Grand Prix instead of the usual 26. David Icke reports.
This dispute, like most of the others, is between the teams with turbocharged cars and those with conventional Ford Cosworth engines, like this March here. The turbo teams are the French Renault, the Italian Ferrari and the British Tolman, and the Cosworth teams are mainly British. The turbo cars are much more powerful, and as you can see in this recent Long Beach Grand Prix, the Ferrari can overtake the Williams almost at will along a straight piece of track. But Grand Prix are not necessarily won by the most powerful cars. The British teams can make up this power deficit in many ways. They have brilliant designers who take every advantage of aerodynamics with the wing there at the back and the shape of the car. And they can make the car handle and respond better than the turbos, so that while they may be slower down the straight, they're quicker and smoother around the corners. And then, and this is crucial to the present row, they can make the cars lighter than the turbos, down in fact almost to the minimum weight limit of 580 kilos. And if you're clever, and no one doubts the designers are clever, you can even go below that. Now, if we get the mechanics in here to help us get the body of this March, you can see exactly what they've done. They designed a brake cooling system which involved filling this tank here with water. And when the cars started a race, the tank was obviously full. But the turbo teams say once the race got underway, the water was quickly used up, as we can see by pushing this switch. And suddenly the cars were some 45 to 100 pounds lighter and under the minimum weight limit. Then after the race, the tank was filled up again before being weighed, and of course the car was once more within the legal weight limit. Using this system, the Brabham, driven here by Nelson Piquet, and the Williams car came first and second in the Brazilian Grand Prix, with the leading turbo car, a Renault, back in third. But now, after protests from Ferrari and Renault, the Brabham and Williams cars have been disqualified from the race, and Renault have been pronounced the official winners. More than that, it's been ruled that teams can no longer fill up the water tanks after a race, and so cars under the weight limit during a race will now be disqualified. The manager of the Tolman Turbo team puts the case against the water tanks.
Well, they were introduced to circumvent the regulations. They basically are a means by the Cosworth teams. Those are 15-year-old British engines that have been the stalwart of Grand Prix racing. And those teams found themselves at a disadvantage power-wise to turbo engine cars, particularly Renault and Ferrari. Their way of getting even with them was to reduce the weight of their cars and use a loophole in the regulations which allowed them to top up essential fluids at the end of a race. They went a little bit far last year with it by filling oil tanks to the top, when in fact if they ran in that state the engines would blow up. And this year they went a bit further by introducing water-cooled brakes. I believe the FIA had to act. Otherwise, there would be no effective weight limit in Formula One. and the consequences could have been disastrous.
Now, what do you say that the Ford Cosworth teams weren't breaking the rules? I mean, the rules said that they could top up at the end of a race with essential fluids, and that by filling these water tanks, that's exactly what they were doing.
Well, the fluids weren't essential because they are not necessary to cool the brakes. So the word essential is inept. But in any event, I think the main issue that everybody had to confront was whether or not we wanted Formula One to go very, very light. That would have put up cornering speeds, which were already considered to be too high, increased acceleration, meant even shorter braking distances, and I think the drivers were concerned that that could have led up a road nobody wanted to go down.
What's the answer to all this wrangling between the two teams that seems to be going on race after race?
Unfortunately, it needs some skilled diplomacy. Under Mr. Balestre of the FISA, which is the sports governing body, we have about as much finesse as a wounded elephant rushing through the jungle. We need to have somebody in charge of the sport capable of dealing fairly and equitably with the problems and adopting a firm but resolute position in issues like this.
Well, with me is Max Mosley, a director of March Cars and the legal advisor to the Car Constructors Association, the man indeed who argued the case for Williams and Brabham to the International Motorsport Federation. Max Mosley, let me put the point to you first that this, quite simply, is a fair cop. You've been breaking the rules and you've been caught out for it.
No, absolutely not. You see, the rules are very, very clear that that the car must be weighed with its normal quantity of lubricants and coolants. And the water in the tank is a coolant. Water-cooled brakes have been used since 1954. In fact, it was Ferrari who brought them in at Le Mans in 1954, and it was Renault that brought them into Grand Prix racing in 1979. And so it's absurd to say that these liquids are not needed in any way. Well, now, apart from that, as they're needed to cool the brakes, then it's absolutely clear that they are part of the coolants of the car, and as the car must be weighed with its normal quantity of coolants and lubricants, that these tanks must contain the normal quantity when the car is weighed.
But what the turbo teams say is that they're not essential, those water tanks, because what in fact happens is the water is burned off pretty soon after the race starts, which doesn't make it a very good brake cooling system, does it? Because a race is up to 70 laps odd.
Well, they're bound to say, in order to support their thesis, that you don't need the thing, but then one wonders, why did they put it on themselves in 1979? The only problem was they couldn't get it to work. The difference is our people have got it to work. Now, when the car is weighed, as said, it must have that liquid with it. Quite clearly at other times, it may have less than that quantity of liquid with it. But it's no good them coming along and pretending that because we've come up with something new that is a disadvantage to them, that it's not necessary. Simply because they can't make it work doesn't mean it doesn't work.
Why then has the motorsport governing body here gone against you?
Because they've completely misread their own rule. And in fact, they've now introduced, in effect, a new rule and said that you can't top up any liquid or any coolant, a practice which has been going on for 15 years since I've been in motor racing, and perhaps even longer. In fact, I think even longer. And what we're saying, of course, is that they cannot come along now and invent a completely new rule. What they're doing is imposing in Formula One the rule which at present applies in sports car racing, which is you just take the car as it is, take the fuel, take the driver out and weigh it as it is. That's never been the rule in Formula One, and it might suit the turbo people to introduce it, but that's not what rules are all about.
Can I put a very important point to you? How long can motorsport survive this constant wrangling between the Cosworth people and the turbo people? Surely the sponsors, the people that keep this sport going, must be sick and tired of it.
Well, I think this is true, and I think everyone who's interested in motor racing and likes motor racing is sick and tired of it. The difficulty we have is this: everything worked perfectly well until Formula One became very successful and had an enormous television audience. I mean, next to football, the World Cup or the Olympics, it's the biggest television audience. The only difference in it goes on all the time. Now, large multinational companies have now come in wanting to exploit it, to publicise their cars, and without being unkind, they're prepared to do anything to win, and they haven't so far succeeded. It's very annoying if you're a large multinational with an unlimited budget, if you get beaten year after year by people like Brabham and Williams.
Max Mosley, let's hope this is the end of the line of dispute. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, now we've got to get that thing out of the studio. Linda, I'll drive you home in that thing. We'll be on the air tomorrow night and again on Sunday night with special programmes on the Falklands crisis. Till then, good night.